Welcome to a deep dive into inquiry in social studies, our January 17th, 2023 professional development. If you would like a copy of today's presentation, you can use this tiny URL at the top and make a copy of this for yourself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Doran. I'm Secondary Social Studies Curriculum Coordinator here in the Office of Teaching and Learning's Curriculum Division. This is my contact information and the Social Studies website, and my Twitter handle if that's of interest to you. Our presentation today is part of our bigger focus on 3 points of emphasis in CCS social studies this year, and we've characterized that as what we've called tie it all together. A focus on transfer, inquiry, and engagement. So in previous sessions, we've addressed transfer. Today, our focus is on inquiry, and we've defined that as students solving open-ended questions and problems through high-level questions, research, and investigation. And we've given some examples of how students do that in CCS social studies. They can use unit essential questions, lesson compelling questions, and of course our TCI lessons, DBQs, and C3 inquiries. So that's our focal point for today. Again, we're also organized around our big 6 ideas and those overarching essential questions that go along with each of the big 6 ideas that apply to all of our courses. So let's take a look then at what we're going to explore today. So rather than to give you a list of learning targets, I've given you a list of focus questions. So what questions will we be exploring today? Well, first of all, let's visit this topic of inquiry and let's define what we mean by inquiry in social studies. And then secondly, why inquiry? Why do we bother with this at all? Can't we just tell students what they need to know? Third, I want to look at what type of social studies teacher are you? And I'll define that more specifically and how it relates to this concept of inquiry, but you'll be able to do some personal reflection here on this question. And then what is the purpose of social studies? That seems like one we ought to really nail down if we're going to talk about inquiry in social studies. Why do we have social studies at all? Why does it exist? And these 2 questions here, what type of social studies teacher are you and what the purpose of social studies is, are really tied together. So then when we look at these different models of social studies, we're going to ask ourselves, what does inquiry look like in each of these models? So we'll talk about what type of social studies teacher you are, how you embrace a particular model of social studies, which shapes its purpose, and then what does inquiry look like in each of these models. Then we'll move more specifically into inquiry. What are the types of inquiry that we can have students engage in? And then, of course, how do we get started? A very practical thing that we need to know. If inquiry has not been a part of your regular practice in social studies instruction, where do we start? So those are the questions that we're going to tackle today in this deep dive. But deep dive may not even be the best title for this because, as you can see, we're going to cover a lot of ground. And it may really be that what we're trying to do is take a broad swim into inquiry. So you can choose either the deep dive or the broad swim into inquiry. And then finally, what does inquiry look like in today's digital world? So really making this current and relevant to students here in 2023. So all of these are the questions we're going to tackle in this deep dive or broad swim. So let's dig in. First, what is inquiry? Again, from our opening slide, students solve open-ended questions and problems through the use of high-level questions, research, and investigation. So that is the foundational definition that we're using today with inquiry. And notice that it's focused on what students do. So we can't have an inquiry-centered classroom without really defining what it is that we want students to be able to do in that inquiry-centered classroom. So it's not principally just about saying, these are the facts that we want students to come away with, but these are the skill sets and the reasoning dispositions that we want students to come away with. And these are the kinds of things that students need to be able to do in an inquiry-centered classroom. So here's my claim for the day. My claim is this: doing social studies requires doing inquiry. Doing social studies requires doing inquiry. Would you take a few minutes to think about and respond to this in the poll? Do you agree strongly? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you strongly disagree with this poll, with this claim? Doing social studies requires doing inquiry. Just let those responses roll in. And I think we have here a fairly strong consensus that doing social studies requires doing inquiry. That doesn't mean that it always requires you in the social studies classroom to always be doing inquiry. That's not necessarily the claim, but if we're going to have students do social studies, that's really the critical part of this. If they're doing social studies, at some point, at some level, they have to be doing inquiry. They may be learning other things through other methods, but the question really is, can students do social studies without doing inquiry to some degree? And I think we have a pretty strong consensus, not completely unanimous, but a pretty strong consensus on this claim. One of the questions that you might ask then is, why do we do inquiry? And a sub-question of that, what makes inquiry really worth the effort? And I think we would all acknowledge, if you've attempted inquiry in the classroom, you know it's a challenging concept to get students to be able to do, to think independently, to work cooperatively, to solve problems. So take a minute and you can reflect on this in the chat. What makes inquiry worth the effort? Again, as I see responses coming in the chat, absolutely, it makes it worth the effort because of the outcomes, right? Students become independent, critical thinkers. They're able to tackle real-world problems. They're able to solve and address crises in our world because they have learned how to address problems, ask questions, evaluate evidence. So all of those things make inquiry worth the effort, even though we acknowledge it's a lot of work. Absolutely, we want students to become independent and self-directed, right? They're going to be able to apply these inquiry skills outside of the traditional classroom. This is a good summary, I think, 10 reasons to use inquiry-based learning from Trevor McKenzie and Sylvia Duckworth. This is a graphic from Twitter. You can see that they give a number of reasons here, from nurturing student passions and talents, empowering student voice and honoring student choice, increasing motivation, engagement, fostering curiosity and a love of learning, teaching grit, perseverance, growth mindset, self-regulation. Make research meaning and develop strong research skills, as many of you have suggested. Deepen understanding to go beyond memorizing facts and content. Fortify the importance of asking questions. Again, that application even outside of the classroom. Enable students to take ownership over their learning and to reach goals. And to solve the problems of tomorrow in the classrooms of today. Those are just 10 quick reasons why it's important to use inquiry, and I think many of you have captured those ideas as well. We use inquiry in CCS because it also helps our students meet these characteristics of the portrait of a graduate. So if you look at these 6 characteristics that Columbus City Schools says we want our students to walk away with, these 6 characteristics, from adaptability, communication, creativity, critical thinking, global empathy, and technology, I think you'll see many of these weaved throughout our discussion today. When we do inquiry, we promote these dispositions, these characteristics that we want students to walk away with when they leave Columbus City Schools. Now, let's take a little different direction here, and I promised you to look at this question, what type of social studies teacher are you? Now, you may think that's kind of an odd question just to throw in here in the middle of inquiry, but I think it is tremendously important and relevant to this question. What I'd like you to do is just complete this quick survey. You're going to indicate your core beliefs about teaching and learning social studies. So, and this is linked down below as well, or if you have a copy of this presentation, you can click on the survey here and it looks like this. Enlarge that a little bit. And you can see this question. Choose 4 statements below that best reflect your philosophy and vision for social studies education. Choose 4 statements below, and you'll see a range of statements about what teachers should be doing in the social studies classroom. Now, I'm just going to scroll down here. You have 12 statements, and I will show you that when you hit submit, it's going to show you where each of these statements falls into these different models of social studies that we're going to talk about. So I want you to just go ahead and take a few minutes, identify 4 of these, and there may be more than 4, but try to find the 4 that you think best represent your vision of what good social studies teaching is all about. So when I hit the submit button here, you can see that if you indicated statements 1, 4, 7, and 9, that places you in the model of citizenship transmission. If you selected statements 3, 6, 10, and 12, that places you in the area of the social science inquiry model. If you selected statements 2, 5, 8, and 11, that puts you in the area of reflective inquiry. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about each of these models because I think it's important, and you may have found that you were in a variety of different categories here. Maybe you were a little bit in social science and a little bit of reflective inquiry. Maybe you were completely balanced across the 3 models, or maybe you are entirely in one model or the other. But I think this does impact when we think about this, what the mission of social studies is, and then how we can frame inquiry around the mission of social studies. So that fundamental question then, what is the purpose of social studies? And I've given you 3 models here, as you can see from the survey. The first model is the citizenship transmission model. In this model, social studies is seen as really an agent of socialization. It involves the transmission of certain historical truths and civic values. That is, we're trying to transmit these truths, these facts, and these civic values and civic virtues from one generation to the next. And so in this model, social studies is that critical agent of socialization. And so you can see if you responded in the affirmative, if you selected any of those statements, this is probably how you think of, at least partially, the role of social studies education. If you're in the social science disciplines model, here we're talking about really applying the tools of social science disciplines. And by that, we might also mean humanities disciplines, history, political science, economics, geography, sociology, psychology, anthropology. All of these can be involved in social science disciplines. And we're doing that to analyze real world problems. So in the social science disciplines, if you are for example, you have a background in economics, you might be high in the social science disciplines because you really want to apply those principles of micro and macroeconomics, and you want students to see how those particular principles apply to certain historical situations, and also how you can use those principles to address real world problems. And so we'll look at what inquiry looks like in this social science disciplines model. And then closely related but different is the reflective inquiry model. Now, this is really based on the pragmatism or instrumentalism that comes in the early 20th century, in the progressive era. This is really the origins of social studies education. It has some of the same intellectual underpinnings as sociology as an academic discipline. as social work, which is kind of the application of sociology. And then in social studies, it's kind of the K-12 world of how we do that. So here we're looking at a specific purpose for creating a better society, right? That's what the progressive era was all about. That's what sociology was all about. Now, you might think that sounds a lot like social science disciplines, but there is a little difference here. We are still using social science disciplines, but here we're usually doing it in a more transdisciplinary way. We're not confining ourselves to one simple discipline. We're working across disciplines, and we're doing it for a specific purpose, and we're usually doing it through collaboration and problem solving. And again, because this is pragmatic, it involves instrumentalism, it really has that end goal of improving and changing society. And in reflective inquiry, this is origins here again from John Dewey. If you're familiar with the history of education and the history of social studies education, that really is where this reflective inquiry model comes from. And so a lot in this reflective inquiry model is also tapping into student interests in what students are concerned and passionate about, and how they can solve those kinds of issues. So those are three models of social studies instruction. The question then becomes, what does inquiry look like in each model? So wherever you found yourself, take a minute to think about then, what does it mean to do inquiry if I'm a citizenship transmission teacher, if I'm a social science disciplines teacher, or a reflective inquiry teacher, or I'm some combination thereof? What does that look like to do inquiry? You can throw some answers in the chat as well. So if you're citizenship transmission, you probably focus on factual kinds of inquiries, right? You want students to get the right answers. There's a specific body of information that you believe it's important to convey to students. And so in the citizenship transmission model, again, if our emphasis is on historical truths, historical facts, getting information right to pass on from one generation to the next, there's probably also an emphasis on political history and founding documents. Because of this citizenship or this civic purpose that you see social studies fulfilling to pass from one generation to the next, that tends to be where the emphasis is. Certain civic values, certain principles of government that cross time and place. And so even if you're not teaching early American history, but maybe you're teaching modern US history and you're looking at some of these same founding principles, or how the principles of these founding documents permeate throughout history. Even if you're looking at world history, maybe you're looking at those kinds of questions as they relate to other governments, ancient, early modern kinds of governments. So that tends to be the focal points of citizenship transmission. Again, tends to emphasize political history, an emphasis on certain information. Whereas in the social science disciplines, as you can imagine, one of the goals here is to determine the best social science tools and methods to use. So you're really trying to become that social scientist and figure out, in solving this particular problem, am I an economist? Is this best addressed through anthropology? What insights would political science have into this? And then within those disciplines, what are the right methods to use? So the social science disciplinary approach is going to emphasize process over content, meaning here it's going to be more emphasis on the development of skills than it is over getting the right information. Because for you as the social science disciplines teacher, you're not nearly as concerned with students having the right factual information and passing that from one generation to the next. You're really primarily interested in students developing the right skill sets, right? And they can apply that to many different content. Again, the reflective inquiry model is close, but differs a little bit, as I mentioned, in that it uses this transdisciplinary approach. So it's not so concerned that you become the sociologist or the anthropologist or the economist, but it might employ all of those tools and literature and philosophy and history. And certainly, again, this comes from John Dewey, who had a background in many of those things: philosophy, psychology, sociology. So you can see that again is applied to real world issues. And I think one of the key elements here as well is that it's action oriented. So while both social science disciplines and reflective inquiry do involve tackling real world issues, reflective inquiry is very explicit about making sure that there is action on the back end of that, right? And so if you think about like the C3 framework from National Council for Social Studies, it's that taking informed action, that end of the inquiry arc that the reflective inquiry model very much reflects. Again, here's what that looks like, the C3 inquiry arc. As you can see, I think it has certainly more elements of the social science disciplinary lens and the reflective inquiry model. The C3 framework intentionally is not content heavy because they wanted to leave a lot of wiggle room for if this was going to be used in various states, for states to define their own content, what they want students to know. As you have seen lately, that can often be a sticking point, a controversial point. And so it was thought that by sort of leaving this as really here's the approach that we want students to take, here's the skill sets, the reasoning capacities, and the taking informed action that we want them to develop, and leave some of the content up to the state and local. So that's where the C3 framework fits into these inquiry approaches. And it really looks at what are the questions, what are the sources, what are the tasks. And on your own, you can explore c3teachers.org and you will find really a load of model lessons that utilize the C3 framework and this inquiry approach. So next we are into this question, what are some types of social studies inquiry? So the first type would be a structured inquiry. That is entirely teacher designed. So the teacher has selected the questions, they've selected the sources, they've selected the tasks. The student's job is to respond to that question using the sources provided, given the task that's provided. In a guided inquiry, this is partially teacher designed, but then also incorporates student research. So here in the guided inquiry, the teacher may design the question, maybe one or two of the sources, but then students have to go outside of those sources and bring in additional sources and information. So it's guided. We're moving students through the steps of the inquiry process in a guided way, but it's not quite entirely structured for them. Then we can try the student-directed model, and that's where student interests, questions, and research really drive what happens here. Again, if you're trying to relate this to the models of social studies, you can imagine here that in the reflective inquiry approach would be very much consistent with the student-directed model, where we're looking at what are the students' concerns and allowing them to generate some questions and research for themselves and then decide what to do about that, how to communicate it, and if we're in an action project, what leads to that informed action, that communicating conclusions and taking informed action. So again, let's think about then in these broad categories, what are some things that you are currently doing to implement, or would you like to do to implement structured, guided, student-directed, and action inquiry? And you can see along the bottom, I have some Jamboards set up for you, and the tiny URL is indicated there. If you have a copy, you can also click on any of these and just throw on some sticky notes on where you see yourself currently implementing, or where would you like to implement one or more of these approaches. What are some of your current tools and resources and strategies for implementing these inquiry models? And we'll just go ahead and start taking a look at these as you're filling them out. Start here with structured inquiry. Structured inquiry, many of you have noted here using DBQs and primary sources. I think that's a very good example of structured inquiry. Getting students pointed in the right direction and led by prompts. Also the TCI framework, some have noted the preview topic with real-life student comparisons, the guided reading questions, the processing. I think that the TCI very much fits into this idea of the structured inquiry. Others have noted about big questions that let students respond, student responses fall along a spectrum. So those are good examples of structured inquiry. Does it look like we have any yet on the guided inquiry? So we'll allow you to keep thinking there on the subject of guided inquiry. We have quite a bit here on the student-directed inquiry, TCI projects, details about what, but let students inquire about the why. I like this one, reflection after the assignment is a great way to do student-directed inquiry. Have students develop unique solutions to a problem of their choice. See some other specific examples here in 7th grade, in government class, in global issues, all the ways in which you can do student-directed inquiry. And then finally, in action inquiry, this is activism, having students fight for a cause they believe in. They research through others' prior actions how to fight for change that led to the resolution they're seeking. They're taking informed action on critical issues. Civic action projects are examples there, addressing a public policy matter. They can be using social media to share messages via Twitter hashtags or YouTube, public service announcements. This is dimension 4 of the C3 framework, communicating conclusions, taking informed action, and that they're applying lessons from history to today's world. So you may be looking at long-term impact of systemic racism, for example. So you can continue to reflect on those particular ways, but I think you see some good examples here of how we can do inquiry in each of these approaches or each of these types of inquiry. So again, this is a broad swim, I think, as much as a deep dive. So we're tackling yet another question here, and that is, well, how do we get started with inquiry at all, right? There's a lot that can be done in inquiry. We've seen different types of inquiries based on different models of social studies. How do we get started? One of those is to utilize what's called the question formulation technique, and this comes from the Right Question Institute. And they've suggested a model that's really, I think, quick and easy to get started, having students especially formulate their own questions. And so they have suggested these 5 steps here. First of all, developing a question focus, which can be anything but a question. Producing your questions, improving your questions, strategizing, and reflecting. So let's just take a look at this quick 90-second video about the question formulation technique.
Hey there, Aaron here from InquireEd. The question formulation technique, often referred to as the QFT, was developed by the Right Question Institute as a simple step-by-step process that helps anyone produce, improve, and prioritize questions. It's a powerful strategy, and that's why we're here with a 90-second breakdown of how the QFT can work in your classroom. The QFT starts with a Q focus, the spark that jumpstarts the production of questions. The Q focus can be a statement, image, phrase, or situation, as long as it is clear and interesting enough to activate curiosity. One hard and fast rule, though, the Q focus can't be a question. Before you start producing questions, pick someone to write down and number the questions as they come. Then review the rules. Rule number 1, generate as many questions as possible. Rule number 2, do not discuss, answer, or judge any questions. Rule number 3, write down every question exactly as it is stated. Rule number 4, change any statements to questions. Take 4 to 5 minutes to produce questions using a timer to keep you on task. Once you're done, it's time to improve your questions. Set your timer for another 4 to 5 minutes, then categorize questions into open and closed, labeling each with a C or an O. Next, discuss the advantages and disadvantages of both types of questions. Finally, change one open question to closed, and vice versa. Okay, only a few more steps. First, prioritize your questions, setting the timer for 3 minutes and placing an X next to your top 3. Don't forget to discuss why you've chosen them. Afterwards, take another 2 minutes to discuss and plan your next steps, describing what you'll do with your questions. Don't forget to reflect on what you've done and what you've learned. And that's a 90-second breakdown of the QFT. Now go ask some questions.
Again, that's just a quick introduction to the question formulation technique. Later in this professional development day, you'll have the opportunity to dig in a little bit deeper into the QFT as well. But I thought you might also want to see, well, what does the QFT look like in action? So we're going to just play a portion of this video that will show how the QFT works in an actual classroom.
My name is Linksa Chesnakis, teach 12th grade humanities, and today we'll be doing the question formulation technique. I think of the QFT as a thinking strategy, and what students are going to be doing is preparing for a Socratic seminar tomorrow where they're going to be discussing questions that they created today. And I'm not going to be doing any of the generating questions, all that work is on them. And they're also going to be using those questions to help them break down the writing process when they get to their final assessment for the book that we're about to finish reading, which is called The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. So let's get right into it. Group 1 and 2, this is your Q focus. Junior thinks that Trujillo treated the Dominican Republic like it was his plantation and he was the master. This may look familiar to you from the book. Group 3 and 4, this is your Q focus. Fate controls lives. We just have to accept that. All right, ready, set, go. 5 minutes.
Who was Trujillo?
Remember to write down questions exactly as stated.
Yo, where's T from? His name is T now. Where's T from? T. Where's T from?
Of course, Dia.
What's
Who controls fate? Yeah, that's what I said. What controls fate?
I think he exaggerated how Trujillo was.
Discuss it. So how did he become so powerful?
It's okay.
So does he have any kids or relatives?
Oh, what relation had Junior with Trujillo?
Another minute, keep going.
Oh, that is a good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Every group try to get a couple more questions out. What are open-ended questions?
Open-ended questions. Open-ended questions require an explanation. It cannot be answered with yes or no, or with one word.
Thank you. Okay, so go to it. You have a minute to classify your questions, okay? And if you're not sure, ask your partners. If you're not sure, ask your group members.
What controls fate? Is that a quote? Closed-ended or open-ended? Because you can't answer it with it's an open-ended question because you can't really answer it with a yes or no answer.
Close is yes or no, right?
Yeah.
I'm
Open
thinking
is like you can answer like a one-word answer. Does fate exist? So
That's close.
How does this shape? Instead of putting how, just put does this shape. So that's a yes or no, because it's open-ended.
Wait, I don't like how that sounds.
What are some good things, some advantages of a closed-ended question, meaning one that can only be answered with a word or yes or no? Yeah, Evan?
Straight to the point. You have the answer like that.
How about the disadvantages, some not so good things about closed-ended questions, meaning questions that have one-word answers or yes or no, some disadvantages. Kenny?
You don't give enough details.
You don't give enough detail?
It's not really saying anything.
It's not really saying anything?
You just have a bunch of follow-up questions. If you found one question that just sets you up to answer all of those questions, then that'd be better. You get all the information you're looking for.
So what you're going to do in the next 2 minutes, you're actually going to manipulate your questions now, okay? Choose one close-ended that you labeled with a C. Make it open by either adding or taking away a word. Then choose an open-ended question, make it closed. Close it off. You could take away, add a word, okay? So just choose one of each. So choose one closed, make it open. Choose one open, make it closed. Okay, so take 3 minutes to decide what your 3 most important are, deliberate, circle them, and then write down why you chose them. Okay?
And whatever, like the 3 best questions.
I think we should choose the 2 that we switched.
Well, I'll pause it there. Again, you'll have the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the question formulation technique later in this session. But this gives you the idea of the QFT, how it can be used to begin the inquiry process and to see that in action. Another way to get started with inquiry, as we've already mentioned, is the fact that inquiry drives the TCI approach. And so in all of your TCI programs from 6th grade through high school global issues are all organized around this inquiry model that begins with an essential question, contains a preview activity, an engagement strategy, and a processing task. Again, all around this essential lesson question that you can use to tie to some of the bigger overarching essential questions of our course. So as you dig into your individual TCI programs, you'll see the TCI inquiry model at work in every instance. Now, later in this professional development, you'll have the opportunity to see 2 engagement strategies, problem-solving group work and social studies skill builder, and how those relate to this process of inquiry. The final question we want to tackle today then is, what does inquiry look like in today's digital world? So we know here we are, we've come back, we are in person now, full in person this year. Last year we were full in person, but with a lot of other quarantines and student absences that often students were in remote situations for long periods of time. But now we're back, we're face to face. And one of the things that a lot of you have said is, you know, sometimes students are tired of being on the Chromebooks. They're tired of being in the digital world. And that's understandable from the fact that they were compelled to be in that world for so long. And I think one of the discussions that we really never fully fleshed out before we moved into that remote model on an emergency basis was really, what does instruction look like in the digital world? So we have the devices, but what should we be doing with them? And if we're merely using those devices for substitution and augmentation, then it's especially understandable how students became weary on those. And I don't say that to be critical at all. I think the fact that any of you pulled off remote learning in the circumstances that you did is nothing short of miraculous. So I don't say that to be critical. I just say that to be, I think, where we are now is trying to then redefine, if we have technology, what are we using it for? So if we think about the SAMR model, how are we using technology to go even beyond augmentation and substitution into modification and redefinition, into that transforming of teaching and learning? I think the TPACK model is still immensely useful here in today's digital world. So thinking about the content that we want students to have, the skills that we want students to have, what our pedagogical approach is going to be, and how we're going to leverage technology at the intersection of all of those. So as we think about inquiry in the digital world, keep in mind the SAMR and the TPACK framework and how we're using them to transform teaching and learning. Here's a sample from the TPACK model. If we wanted to study about the Civil War and look at all of the ways in which these domains work together. So we're utilizing computer skills to locate digital resources and create videos. We're locating primary sources in online collections. The content knowledge The content knowledge, we want students to analyze the causes of the Civil War. We want them to do that through primary sources and evaluating those for credibility, bias, and evidence. We want to do that in an inquiry-based approach. That's our pedagogy. We want them to use online tools for creating digital documentaries. And when we put it all together in this TPACK framework, we have students creating a digital documentary about the causes of the Civil War based on primary source evidence obtained from research in online collections. So that's a really 10-second speed-through version of what TPACK might look like in the social studies classroom. Again, SAMR, substitution and augmentation are not wrong. There's some things we just do on the computer instead of doing them on paper now. But we also want to look at transformation. How do we go beyond simply using things in a Google Doc to modification, where maybe it's a collaborative wiki, which can be done in any Google app? Or maybe it's redefinition, where students are now publishing a documentary on YouTube and sharing it with a global audience. So you think about everything we said related to taking informed action, communicating conclusions, and taking informed actions on a particular issue. Certainly, we can do things that we couldn't do before in this digital world today. What I'd like you to do now is go into an independent investigation. Since this is a focus on inquiry, I want you to have some chance to do inquiry yourself and to choose one area of focus by reviewing one slide that follows. And I want you to reflect on these questions as you do so. So I guess this is a guided inquiry. How does this topic relate to the points in today's session? The model of social studies, the types of inquiry, C3 framework, SAMR, TPACK. Secondly, what are the challenges and opportunities of teaching with inquiry in the digital age? And then third, what are the key takeaways for classroom instruction? So you're going to choose one of these slides. We have hyperdocs as inquiry, and you can see that everything in this table is a hyperlink. And you can also, if you've made a copy, you can use this space for notes and reflection as well. Hyperdocs as inquiry. Again, some of these will be videos, some articles, some samples, research databases and collections, looking at some that are available within our InfoHio collection, as well as some other resources that students can use for collecting and evaluating sources. Civic Online Reasoning. If you're not familiar with Civic Online Reasoning, that has come out of the Stanford History Education Group, you can tackle this one along with some extra resources available there. Computational thinking, maybe one you haven't thought much about in terms of social studies, but there's a lot of application of computational thinking in social studies as well, and some great resources there for you to consider. And then also think about digital creation and communication tools for students to take that informed action. What are some resources that they can utilize to do that? So I'm going to give you the remaining time now to really tackle and reflect on one of these specific topics. And you can think about and reflect on these three specific questions. And when you've concluded that, we are concluded with this first session.